Montana Territory, July 1882. The letter came in the same wagon that carried sacks of flour and a busted crate of apples. And by the time Susanna Kittredge read it, her hands had gone still. The paper trembled slightly between her fingers, the words inked out like a sentence. You must marry or leave by fall. This is not a home for unwed women. She folded the letter once, then again, until it disappeared into the pocket of her apron. The summer sun was high over the Bitterroot Mountains, and somewhere behind the house, her younger sister's baby was crying again. Susanna pushed open the back door and stepped outside, heart pounding against her ribs like a warning. She had not come here to marry. She had come to bury her sister. 2 months ago, her sister Lydia had died birthing her second child on the floor of this 2-room house in the middle of nowhere. The baby, Sarah, had survived, as had 5-year-old Samuel. Their father, a trapper Lydia married in haste, had not come back after the winter thaw. No one had heard from him since, so Susanna stayed. She fed the children, cleaned the farm, and kept her grief quiet. She wrote to the reverend at the church who had agreed to let her stay in Lydia's stead. And now, this letter. She stood along while watching the dust swirl near the horizon. A fence needed mending near the barn. The goats had gotten into the garden again. Nothing waited but work. Later that afternoon, she packed a small satchel and kissed the children goodbye. Mrs. Eves from the neighboring farm would watch them for the night. She needed to speak to the reverend in town. She needed to understand how a woman who had crossed plains and mountains to save her family could still be turned out in the end. The ride into town was rough, 7 miles along dirt and stone, the mule pulling stubbornly. She arrived near dusk, hair loose from its pins, skirt dusty, face drawn. As she tied off at the post near the general store, she heard the familiar clang of boot heels on wood. Miss Kittredge, she turned. The voice was low, steady. It belonged to a tall man in a worn brown hat, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, dust streaking the sides of his trousers. His face was tanned and solemn, eyes dark and calm like river stones. "Do I know you?" she asked. "Name's Nolan Jarrett." "I work the South Range for the McAllisters." He nodded toward the fields beyond the saloon. "I heard about Lydia. I am sorry." She stared, unsure how to answer. His voice carried no pity, only understanding. "I was in town when the preacher got that letter out," he added quietly. "He means to stick by it." "I buried my sister with my own 2 hands," she said, her voice sharper than it meant to be. "I have raised her children since April. I did not come here to marry Mr. Jarrett. I came here to make sure those children lived." Nolan looked at her a long moment. Then he said, "You should come with me." "I beg your pardon," he nodded toward his horse. "I have a cabin. It is quiet, safe. You and the children can stay there. No one will tell you to leave." She blinked at him. "You do not even know me." "I know enough," he said. "I know you did not walk away. That counts for something." Her throat tightened. "I am not offering marriage," he said. "Not unless that is what you want. But if what you need is time and a place, I can give you that. You and the children." Susanna's fingers curled around the strap of her satchel. "And what would people say, Mr. Jarrett?" "Let them talk," he said. "You can stay as long as you want." She looked away, blinking fast. The weight of the last weeks pressed down on her chest, and for the first time she felt something shift. Not hope, not yet, but something close. "I will need to get the children in the morning," she said. "I will ride with you," Nolan said. They rode back the next day, the 3 of them, Susanna, Nolan, and the mule cart rattling behind them. Samuel looked up at Nolan with wide, silent eyes, while baby Sarah slept in Susanna's arms. The house behind them looked smaller now, stripped down to its bones. Nolan's cabin sat near the edge of Elk Creek, 2 miles past the McAllister Ranch. The porch faced east, and the wind rustled through tall cottonwoods nearby. Inside, it was clean and simple: 1 main room, a loft above, a hearth at the center. Nolan hauled in a cradle from the barn and set it beside the hearth. He said little, only that they would figure out the rest tomorrow. That night, Susanna sat on the porch steps beside him, her dress hem brushing the floorboards. The stars blinked open above them, quiet and endless. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. He did not look at her, only said, "Because you should not have to fight alone." She looked down at her hands. "People think I am difficult, too proud, too serious." He reached for her hand, simple and sure, his palm warm against hers. "I think you are strong," he said, and for the first time in a long time she let herself believe it. By the end of the week, Samuel followed Nolan everywhere, into the barn, up the pasture, down to the creek. He never said much, but he watched Nolan like he was trying to learn something. "You are good with him," Susanna said one evening after Samuel had fallen asleep near the hearth. Nolan shrugged. "I was the oldest of 4, raised them after my pa died. You get used to holding things together." She looked at him then, really looked, the quiet steadiness, the patience, the way he waited for her to speak, never pressing. "You do not say much," she said. "I say what matters," Susanna nodded slowly. "That is rare." He met her eyes. "So are you." The next morning she found a small wooden box on the table. Inside was a silver hairpin, simple and elegant. "I saw it at the store," Nolan said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Thought maybe you would like something that was just yours." Susanna's heart tugged. She had not owned anything fine in years. "Nolan, you do not have to say anything," he said. "Just, I wanted you to know." She reached up and tucked the pin into her hair. Then she turned and kissed his cheek. "Thank you," she whispered. He stood still a moment, then gently reached out, brushing a curl back from her forehead. "You are not alone anymore," he said, and this time she believed him. The first frost came early that year, veining the windows with white and crisping the edges of the last squash on the vine. Susanna pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stepped out with kindling, her boots crunching over brittle leaves. The air had a stillness to it that morning, the kind that settled in deep and didn't lift until spring. Inside, Sarah stirred in her cradle, fussing until Susanna's fingers brushed her cheek. Samuel was already up, crouched beside Nolan near the hearth, watching him carve a strip of cedar down to a hollow whistle. "That one's for the wind," Nolan said. "You hang it outside and it sings when the weather changes." "Will it scare foxes off?" Samuel asked, his eyes on the blade. "Maybe. But it'll scare ghosts better." Samuel didn't smile, but he leaned closer. Susanna poured water into the kettle. "He's taken to you," she said quietly. Nolan didn't look up. "He's a boy who's had to grow up faster than he should have." "I know that kind." She watched the way his hand moved steady along the grain of the wood, the way he made room for silence without letting it grow heavy. It was a kind of gentleness she hadn't known men could possess. Later, she sat at the table with mending in her lap while Nolan stepped out to split wood. The door creaked open again sooner than she expected, but it wasn't Nolan, it was Mrs. Eves, cheeks flushed and bonnet askew. "I came by to see how you're holding," she said, unpinning her gloves. "And to bring some of my boys' old coats. Yours'll need them soon." Susanna stood to greet her. "You're very kind," Mrs. Eves waved her off. "Don't flatter me, dear. I just know what it's like to be passed over and talked about by people who never lifted a hand to help." She set the bundle on the table, then paused. "You staying here with Nolan Jarrett? There'll be words, you understand." "There already were," Susanna said. Mrs. Eves nodded once, approving. "Then let them talk. Better a warm roof and steady hands than a preacher who'd rather see you gone than fed." After she left, Susanna stepped out to the porch. Nolan was stacking the last of the wood, sleeves rolled, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt. "Mrs. Eves says I'll be the talk of town." He didn't turn. "You worried?" "No," she said. "I just wonder if you are." He set the last log down and looked at her. "I've never asked this town for permission to live how I see fit." She stepped down beside him, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "You make it sound easy." "It's not," he said. "But it's better than letting other folks decide what kind of life you get to have." She studied him a moment, then said, "You ever think about marrying?" He wiped his hands on a rag, slow and thoughtful. "Once. A long time back, we were young." She wanted more than this place could give. I couldn't blame her for going. Susanna nodded, her gaze drifting toward the hills. "I thought I'd have a schoolhouse by now, somewhere small, maybe even a garden." Instead, I have a boy who won't speak at night, a baby who won't sleep, and a home that isn't mine." Nolan leaned his shoulder against the porch post. "You've got more than that," she looked at him. "You've got people who count on you and a place that's steady. That counts for more than land or papers." Her voice dropped. "And you," he held her eyes. "I'm here, ain't I?" That night, after the children were down, she found herself near the fire again, her fingers brushing the edge of the cradle. Nolan sat nearby, oiling the hinges of a door he'd taken down from the loft. "You always take care of things that have been left too long?" she asked. He glanced up. "Only the ones that still got use left in them." She crossed to him, kneeling beside the door. "Do you think I'm one of those?" His voice was quiet. "You're not broken, Susanna, just tired." She didn't answer, not right away, but her hand found his, and when he turned his palm up to meet hers, she didn't pull away. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "I know." His thumb brushed over her knuckles. "But I want to." In the quiet, the fire cracked, and somewhere outside the wind picked up. She didn't speak again, didn't move. Just let herself stay there beside him, the warmth between them quiet and steady. The snow held off longer than anyone expected. By the time the first flakes fell, Susanna had taken to walking the ridge above the creek in the mornings. Sarah bundled against her chest and Samuel trailing behind, his small boots leaving twin impressions in the frost-hardened earth. She liked the hush of it up there, the way the land opened wide and honest, nothing hidden. It gave her time to think. They were nearing the end of October when Nolan came home with a leather-bound book tucked under his coat. He set it on the table without a word, went back out to unsaddle the mare. Samuel reached for it first. Susanna lifted the cover, surprised to see blank pages stitched with care, the kind meant for keeping accounts or copying verse. "There's a fellow in town who does binding. Had it made for you," Nolan said when he came back in, brushing snow from his shoulders. "Thought maybe you'd want to write again." She didn't ask how he knew. She'd kept her letters folded deep in her trunk, the ones she'd written to Lydia and never sent, the ones she'd written after. "I might," she said, fingertips grazing the edge of the paper. "Thank you," he shrugged, but his eyes held steady on hers. "Didn't want you forgetting you're more than what this place demands from you." That night, after the children were down, she opened the book by lamplight. She didn't write at first, just stared at the emptiness of it, the possibility. Then slowly, words began to come. By the second week of November, the first real storm rolled in. Wind howled through the trees and a branch broke clean from the cottonwood near the barn. Nolan hauled it in the next morning, split it down for kindling. "You ever seen a winter through this far north?" he asked. "No," she said, wrapping Sarah tighter. "Kansas winters were dry, but not like this." "You'll need more wool," he said, "and the boy boots he can grow into." "I'll sew what I can." "There's a bolt of flannel tucked in the chest." Nolan nodded, then hesitated. "I've got a line on a couple pelts, might trade for your cloth and salt. You all right with me taking the better mule?" She looked up from the stew she was stirring. "You don't need to ask." He didn't answer right away. "Then, maybe I do." She wiped her hands on her apron. "Nolan, you've given us more than I could have asked. If you're going after something that'll keep this house warm and the children fed, then take what you need." He tilted his head, eyes narrowing slightly. "You ever let anyone take care of you before?" She didn't look away. "No, but I'm learning." He left before dawn the next day, bundled in oilskin and wool. The wind had settled into a long, low moan across the hills. Samuel watched from the window until Nolan's shape disappeared down the tree line. "Will he be gone long?" he asked. "Just the day," she said, setting bread to rise. "He always comes back." By mid-afternoon, snow began to fall again. Susanna pulled the children close near the hearth, reading aloud from an old reader she'd found in Lydia's trunk. Sarah gripped her fingers and babbled nonsense, while Samuel leaned against her side, half listening, half asleep. When Nolan returned near dusk, his coat was stiff with ice and his beard dusted in white. He carried 2 wrapped bundles and a new pair of boots slung over his shoulder. "Didn't see another soul all day," he said, stomping snow from his boots. "Traded with a trapper out past the ridge. He was drunk but fair." She took the bundles from him, her hands brushing his. "You're frozen through." "Not the first time," she stepped closer, voice low. "Still." "You came back." He looked at her then, something quiet moving behind his eyes. "I said I would." She took the boots to the corner, showed Samuel how to tug them on over thick socks. He didn't speak, but his arms wrapped around Nolan's leg briefly before he hurried off to bed. Later, Susanna stood behind Nolan as he sat near the fire, her hands smoothing over his shoulders, slow and steady. "You didn't have to do all that," she said. "I know." She moved around to face him, lowered herself to the chair beside him. "I'm not used to someone meaning what they say." "I don't say anything I don't mean." She reached for his hand, resting her fingers lightly in his. "And if I asked you to stay for good," he didn't answer right away. He looked at her long and sure, then said, "Then I would." Her throat tightened. "I don't have much to offer. You've built a home with nothing but grit and grief. You've raised 2 children not your own. You think I'm looking for more than that." When he leaned in, it wasn't sudden. It was slow, deliberate. He paused just close enough for her to feel the warmth of his breath. "I want to build it with you, Susanna." She kissed him before the words could settle too deep between them, soft, certain, without apology. When she pulled back, her eyes were wet. "Then stay," she said. "Not just for now. For always." He stood, pulling her gently to her feet, his hands cradling her face. "As long as you'll have me." Outside, the wind died down. Inside, the fire burned steady, and the house once filled with only silence and memory finally felt like home. Thanksgiving passed quiet and unmarked, save for a pot of boiled beans and the last of the cornmeal Nolan had traded for weeks back. Samuel had pressed a pine cone into Susanna's hand that morning rough, a bit sticky with sap, and said nothing. She tucked it into the mantel beside a candle stub without asking where he'd found it. By early December, the snow had deepened past the fence posts. The world outside the cabin turned white and still, the kind of stillness that settled in the lungs. Nolan kept the paths clear to the well and barn, hauling water in thick gloves and patching the roof where the ice crept in. Susanna spent her mornings sewing by the window, her stitches slow, methodical, the needle steady in her hands. The silence between them had changed. It no longer pressed, no longer weighed. It held. One morning she found Nolan standing in the doorway of the loft, holding a folded length of flannel the color of rust. "I can make Samuel another shirt from that," she said, brushing past to set bread to rise. He didn't move. "I was thinking we ought to build a second room," she turned. "Where? Off the west wall, enough for the children so they've got their own space." She set her hands on her hips. "That'll take more than timber, nails, hinges. And time. I've already spoken to Emmett McAllister. He's setting aside some boards from the mill when the thaw comes. Said I could pay in fence work and draft help." She stepped closer. "You've planned all that?" "I've thought about what it means, you being here. What it should look like if we're building something that lasts." Her voice softened. "You're not the only one that's thought on it." He didn't reach for her, just stood there, waiting. She touched his sleeve. "I'd like a room with morning light. I'll build it that way." That night, they moved the cradle closer to the wall, and Sarah slept deeper than she had in weeks. The wind picked up again, pushing against the walls in long, low moans, but Susanna didn't stir. She lay beside Nolan under the quilt, his arm around her waist, their breath rising in time. 2 days later, a rider came through on a borrowed gelding. He was narrow in the face, eyes rimmed red from cold, and his coat bore the patch of the county office in Missoula. "You're Susanna Kittredge?" he asked, glancing between her and Nolan. "I am," she said, stepping out into the snow. "Got word from Fort Benton. Fellow named Alan Kittredge signed in with the quartermaster, listed your sister as next of kin." Her mouth went dry. "That's Lydia's husband. Didn't say much else. He's headed south with some freight outfit, might be through here come spring." When the man rode off again, Nolan stood beside her, jaw tight. "He's coming back," she said, voice flat. "Maybe," Nolan said. "Or maybe he's just passing through." She turned to him, arms crossed beneath her shawl. "What happens if he wants to take the children?" Then we don't let him, her eyes narrowed. He's their blood. He left them to starve. She said nothing for a long while, then moved to the porch rail, her breath fogging in the cold. I can't lose them, she said finally. You won't, she looked over. You sound so sure. Because I know the law's not blind. And I know what kind of man walks away from a family in a Montana winter. He won't fight for them, not really. She turned fully then, her voice low but fierce. If he does, you'd stand with me. He didn't hesitate. I already am. That night she sat near the hearth, Sarah asleep in her lap. She watched Nolan pull the ledger from the shelf and dip the pen in ink, recording the month's stores with quiet precision. I never asked what you wanted before all this, she said. He looked up. Before what? Before me, the children, this house full of noise. He smiled, faint and tired. I wanted to wake up somewhere I belonged, she swallowed. And now, I want to wake up beside you, her throat tightened. Even if he comes back and makes a mess of it, I'll still be here. She looked down at the child in her arms, then back to him. Then let's marry. He set the pen down gently. You sure? I wasn't before, but I am now. He crossed to her, kneeling before the chair, his hand covering hers. We'll do it right, quiet, just us, she nodded. That's all I ever wanted. Outside, snow drifted down in soft, slow turns. Inside, the fire burned low, steady and warm, and the promise between them settled deep into the bones of the house. The snow had risen past the lower panes by the time the Reverend arrived, his sleigh trailing narrow furrows behind the horses. Samuel watched from the window, his face unreadable, Sarah asleep across Susanna's lap. She'd wrapped the baby in the shawl Nolan's mother had made long ago, soft wool worn thinner at the edges, still warm. The Reverend stepped inside with a gust of wind and cedar smoke. His eyebrows lifted at the cradle near the hearth, at the boy beside the window, and the woman standing with her hand resting lightly on the shoulder of the man beside her. You sure? He asked, voice low. We are, Nolan said. The binding was quiet, no witnesses beyond the children, no music. The Reverend read from his little leather book, and Susanna answered with clear, steady eyes. Nolan's voice was quieter but not uncertain. When it was done, the Reverend pressed their hands together and gave a short nod before taking his leave, the snow already frosting his collar again. That night, Nolan built a fire high and slow. He didn't say much as he worked, just kept glancing over at her, like he wasn't sure what would come next but wanted to be ready for it. When she crossed the room, she reached for his hand first. I used to think marriage meant giving something up, she said. A piece of yourself, maybe. He watched her, his hand warm in hers. But with you, it feels like I found the rest of me. He didn't answer with words. He stepped forward, leaned his forehead against hers, and let out a long breath that felt like it had been waiting years to be released. They lay beside each other that night, wrapped beneath the old quilt, not with urgency, but with a closeness that had grown daily, shaped by wood smoke and long silences, and the way their hands always found each other in the dark. There was no need to explain anything. Their bodies had known long before their words caught up. The next morning, Samuel laid a fresh pine sprig at the hearth, unprompted. Susanna watched him quietly, her hand resting on Nolan's arm as he stirred oats over the fire. I think he's beginning to feel safe, she whispered. He's got reason to, Nolan said. The weeks passed in rhythm. Snow piled high against the eaves and the lanterns burned longer once the sun dipped. Nolan built a cradle from ashwood and lined it with sheepskin. Not because Sarah needed another, but because his hands needed to work toward something lasting. One evening, Susanna found a folded piece of paper tucked beneath her sewing. It was Nolan's handwriting, careful and blocky. If we ever have another child, I hope she has your eyes. She folded it once, then tucked it into the spine of the book he'd given her. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. In late February, a stranger came up the path. His coat was torn at the sleeve, and he carried himself with a limp favoring his left leg. Samuel stood behind Nolan as the man slowed his horse, his face drawn and raw from wind. I'm looking for Susanna Kittredge, he said. Susanna stepped forward, her voice firm. I'm she. He dismounted stiffly. Name's Nolan Kittredge. Lydia was my wife. Nolan stood beside her without a word, arms crossed. I heard she passed, Alan said. Didn't get the letter till last week. She's buried out back, Susanna said, with a stone in her name carved proper. He looked down. I didn't know you left, she said. Last winter, she waited. He glanced toward the cabin. The children are they're mine now, she said. I've fed them, clothed them, sat through every fever and nightmare. If you've come to take them, you'd best say so plain. Alan didn't answer. He looked at Samuel, then at Sarah, who was gnawing a cloth doll in the cradle. You've done right by them, he said finally. Better than I could have. I ain't got work, barely got a roof, just thought I should know. You do, Susanna said. And now you can go. He nodded slow, then turned to Nolan. You her husband? I am. Alan gave one last glance to the children, then mounted. Take care of them. They watched him ride off, a thin trail of hoofprints marking the snow. Back inside, Samuel climbed onto the bench without a word. He didn't ask who the man was. He just leaned against Nolan's side, and Nolan rested his hand on the boy's back. Later, after the children were asleep, Susanna stood at the window, watching the wind smooth the trail Alan had left. I thought I'd be frightened, she said, but I'm not. You don't owe him anything, Nolan said, coming to stand behind her. No, she said, I owe them everything, and you. He wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. You owe me nothing. But I'm glad you chose me. She turned in his arms then, eyes bright. I did, and I'll keep choosing you. They worked into the thaw, Nolan clearing the ground for the new room, Susanna planting early carrots near the cabin's edge. The days stretched longer, the nights softer. Samuel learned to read from the primer she kept beside the bread tin, and Sarah took her first step over Nolan's boot. By the time the trees began to bud, the new room stood with its window to the east, just as she'd asked. Morning light poured in golden and quiet, warming the floorboards and the cradle alike. On the first warm evening of April, they sat on the porch, watching the creek swell with meltwater. Nolan held Sarah in his arms, her head tucked beneath his chin. Samuel sat beside them, carving a small whistle with a steady hand. Susanna rested her head against Nolan's shoulder. We built something, she said. He kissed the top of her head. We did. And as the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in amber and rose, the house behind them stood whole, filled with laughter and the scent of bread baking and a love that had been earned, not given. They would grow old here, together, and they would never be alone again.